So the half announcement leading into what I'm going to actually be saying is that I recognize a lot of people here who are dyed-in-the-wool Proustians who have read everything I'm going to be talking about in French and English and probably Russian already, as well as some other people who I know are more on the newbie side. So I'm going to try and talk to both halves of the audience. Mostly this is going to be a talk, but I also will read some from the new translation, and I hope that I've cunningly chosen the passages so that they're not just readings, but they'll also be things I can talk about. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is a little bit of the biographical background of Proust and his engagement with John Ruskin's work, what the book is that, or the two books are that Proust produced out of that. Thirdly, what this book is. So this is my new translation and edition, and what it has in it and how it's different. Then I'm going to talk a bit more about the content, so Proust's and also Ruskin's ideas of reading, and then finally my approach to translating this book in relation to Proust's own approach to being a translator himself. So that is the program, unless I keel over, which I plan not to. So Proust, in his mid-20s, had written about 1,000 pages of his first attempted novel that he never managed to pull together, Jean Santeuil. He was good at describing things, but he didn't have any kind of overarching shape for the book. He didn't use the theme of recapturing the past and memory as an organizing principle. He just had it in there. And similarly, the sort of quest for the writer, the young writer, to find his vocation of being a writer, these were not the organizing structures yet that they would be in Remembrance of Things Past. And the sentences were also just not quite there yet. So he was frustrated and discovered John Ruskin. John Ruskin, not as well known today by a very, very long shot as he was 100 years ago. I describe him as a cross between Thoreau, John Singer Sargent, and William James. And if that sounds completely insane, then that's the idea. I mean, he really was this stunningly influential global figure across very many disciplines. When he died, obituary notices, including the one Proust wrote in 1900, mentioned him along with Tolstoy, Ibsen, and Nietzsche. That kind of gives you a sense. A few 100,000 people joined the memorial parade march when he died in England, which became something of a national day of mourning. He was very important. And for Proust, what he was, for Proust, he was this mentor figure that he decided to just completely devote himself to, partly because he was stuck going on his own writing. By 1900, he claimed to know by heart Ruskin's books, 7 Lamps of Architecture, Bible of Amiens, Lectures on Literature and Painting, Val d'Arnaud, and Praeterita, which is Ruskin's autobiography, which by itself is 600 pages. So he seriously immersed himself in Ruskin's work, and especially Ruskin's writings on architecture, the Gothic French architecture of the churches, which of course is so important to Proust. And he ended up translating 2 books by John Ruskin into French, the first translations into French in book form of John Ruskin's. So of the 4.5 books he published in his lifetime, if you count the various parts of Remembrance of Things Past that came out before he died as a half. Two of them were these translations. First of the Bible of Amiens and second of Sesame and Lilies. So Bible of Amiens was the first one, which Proust called, quote, beautiful, unknown, and original, the finest of Ruskin's works, and Ruskin's only book to do with France, being simultaneously about French history, a French city, and the French Gothic style. So what you need to know about that quote is that was his pitch to the publisher. So you need to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. He was obviously hyping it up a bit. But in fact, it is a book centered around a French cathedral. The Bible of Amiens is actually the physical cathedral, especially the West Portal, that Ruskin claims to read. So it's not a Bible in written form, it's a Bible in architectural form that Ruskin is going to explore for us. I personally think that that is one of the big attractions of that book for Proust, which is that it let him turn his pleasure in architecture into a pleasure of reading. What Ruskin's doing is reading this architecture, and that is something Proust always liked for reasons I'll talk about later. Reading is this very privileged form of engagement for him. You may remember that the very first waking thought we get from the narrator in Remembrance of Things Past, he says that for a long time he used to go to sleep early. The book would just fall out of his hand, and without his even realizing it, and the thought that he needed to go to sleep would wake him up. And then the first thought he has when he wakes up is that he actually is whatever it was he was reading about, a church, or a quartet, or the rivalry between Francois I and Charles V. So that's the very first thought of Remembrance of Things Past, which is that he is the church he's reading about. Now, as a translator, he was not just giving French readers the first book of Ruskin's. He had this idea, which is a little bit crazy. It starts normal but quickly gets crazy, as Proust so often does. So what he says is that you can't really know an author when you read the first book of theirs that you read, because you don't know what's specific to this particular subject matter and what it is that's the physiognomy, as he puts it, of the author. And this is quite a good argument, and he makes a very strong analogy, which is Rembrandt paintings. He says you have to look at Rembrandt portraits of a bunch of different people so that you can know what the Rembrandtness is. Otherwise, if you're just looking at one portrait, you don't know if it's just the person that he was painting. So, all well and good. So he then says that what he's going to do is every time he gets to a passage in the book he's translating that reminds him of something in one of the other Ruskin books he's read, he's going to put a footnote and translate that passage for you. And what this will do is give you a makeshift memory of all the other Ruskin books that, in fact, you haven't read yet, but now it's like you've read them. So you're reading along this first book of Ruskin, and you are reminded by seeing Proust's footnote of 25 other Ruskin books, and so it's like you're reading your 26th Ruskin book. Brief digression about that term makeshift memory. It's actually an interesting term and pretty important for Proust. The French is mémoire improvisée, which everyone before that I've run across has translated using the cognate as improvised memory, but I think that's wrong, because the connotation isn't some freewheeling, spontaneous jazz solo memory. The connotation is something that's cobbled together as this substitute that doesn't do quite as good a job as the real thing, but can sort of pass as a substitute. So makeshift memory is really what he's talking about. In an earlier draft version of that passage, he calls it a mémoire factice, which is a fake memory. So he minimized how fake it is, but still, it's not an improvised memory. He chooses them quite carefully, as a way of giving you this fake cardboard version of the 25 Ruskin books that you haven't read yet, but he has. So, Bible of Amiens, then, is a straight-ahead translation of this book of Ruskin's, along with a very long preface, consisting of essays he had been writing over the past 5 years or so as he is getting more and more involved in Ruskin's work. And then these hundreds of footnotes that are usually these strange cross-references to other things that Proust happens to think of. The second book, then, that he translates is Sesame and Lilies, which is similar in content and structure to what I just described, except for three things. So first of all, Sesame and Lilies is Ruskin's book about reading. Actually, there are 2 essays, and then he added in later versions there are more, but the core of it and what Proust translated is 2 essays, the Sesame essay and the Lilies essay. Sesame is on reading, and Lilies is on the education of girls and women, which Proust seems to have found less interesting than the reading one. There's many, many more footnotes in the Sesame essay, and a lot more of his engagement with the book is from the reading part. So because it's about reading specifically and explicitly, as opposed to being about cathedrals, it gives Sesame and Lilies in Proust's version a much more meta, recursive thing going on in ways that I'll talk about in a second. So the second difference is that it is a much more personal, in several ways, preface. Again, there's a long preface to Proust's translation of Sesame and Lilies into French. This time, though, it's not mostly about Ruskin and mostly a sort of informative, standard, prefatory kind of thing that you'd be likely to get in any translator's introduction. Instead, it's his essay on reading, which is the centerpiece of this book, and absolutely exquisite, and Proust's first mature, full-blown writing. The first half of On Reading is in fact memories of being a child in basically Cambrai, reading books on a summer vacation, and it's, as you'll hear, I hope later, it could have come straight out of Swann's Way. It really is him using all these techniques that he's found, and he does that as the first half of his preface on reading before saying, so anyway, now let's talk about what Ruskin says, and mostly he argues against it. So the whole preface is much more Proust as Proust, and much less Proust as translator of Ruskin who's telling you when he was born and what Ruskin's ideas are about the Gothic, etc. Okay, so the third difference between Sesame and Lilies and Bible of Amiens in Proust's translations is that, as I mentioned, he uses his fictional techniques pretty much in full-blown form, but also quite excitingly, since he's using them for the first time, he also explains them. So he'll go and do a scene, and then he'll say, so here's what I just did, in a way that even more than in Remembrance of Things Past gives you a window into what it is he's doing as he's learning how to do it. So that's what these 2 books are, and what I originally wanted to do was the full Proust's, Ruskin's Sesame and Lilies. In other words, the whole Ruskin text with all of Proust's footnotes and the whole introduction. And the idea of that would be to give 3 things. First of all, Ruskin's book itself is pretty great and interesting, and it would, let you see the whole of that. Secondly, it would be this workshop Proust figuring out how to write Remembrance of Things Past right there in front of you. And thirdly, it would be this very interesting artifact of translation, what it is as a creative art, and what Proust thought he was doing when he was translating it and at the same time kind of annotating it and giving his own sort of makeshift memory relation of it to everything else, and giving his own essay up front. So this book is almost that, but it's not quite that. First of all, I ditched the Lilies essay, so this is just the Sesame essay, the reading part. And then secondly, because of reasons of space and to not, basically Hesperus wants 100-page books, and but there are other more intrinsic reasons too, so it's not about that. But some of the content of the Sesame essay, especially the more exclusively like political stuff, was cut. Not all of his hundreds of footnotes were translated in here, but you still have, for the first time in English, Ruskin's text in a basically whole form, so you can see what it is he's bouncing off, with these footnotes at the bottom of the page, so you can see what's going on. On Reading as an essay has been translated into English before, twice. I thought I would just show you. So there's this edition, which was a centennial edition, meaning 1971. Proust was born in 1871, which is what got taken up into this, which is the book that many of you have probably seen or read. This has all of both of his prefaces. It again has a selection of the notes, but it doesn't really have the Ruskin. It has a little like sentence fragment of whatever Ruskin snippet the footnote was attached to, so you can kind of find it, but it's not setting out to show you the interrelation between these parts. It's just setting out to give the more interesting Proust footnotes out of their context. I mean, in fact, he did have a lot of the footnotes can be taken that way. He did not content himself with being scholarly or even with making this makeshift memory. He'll have, you know, a 5-paragraph footnote on lung doctors or Maeterlinck or whatever Proustian topics he felt like doing. He really was seeing this translation project as a vehicle for him to do one of his ever-expanding book projects of his own before he was in a position and able to do it for Remembrance of Things Past. So that's what this book is. Again, it has the 40-year-old translation of On Reading. The other translation of it into English has been by John Sturrock, who did a Penguin Classics version of, again, Sans Beuve that he can't really get in the US. And the On Reading part has been excerpted in this lovely little Penguin book. The fact that you can see it really in tension with and in juxtaposition with Ruskin is a big advantage that this has that you've never really been able to do in English before. There are also a few bits of his other writings on Ruskin, including the part about makeshift memory in here. I have an introduction that covers a lot of this ground, and Eric Karpeles, who many of you may know as the author of Paintings in Proust, has forward as well, and he talks more about sort of relation to Remembrance of Things Past and how Proust's engagement with Ruskin was a step on the path towards the great novel. Okay. Let me read a little now to give you a sense of the content of what they're saying about reading and translation. I will read some Ruskin because, you know, you gotta hear a little of it. This is from in the middle of Sesame and Lilies. But again, I ask you, do you at all believe in honesty or at all in kindness? Or do you think there is never any honesty or benevolence in wise people? None of us, I hope, are so unhappy as to think that. Well, whatever bit of a wise man's work is honestly and benevolently done, that bit is his book or his piece of art. It is mixed always with evil fragments, ill-done, redundant, affected work, but if you read rightly, you will easily discover the true bits, and those are the book. Now, books of this kind have been written in all ages by their greatest men, by great leaders, great statesmen, and great thinkers. These are all at your choice, and life is short. You've heard as much before, yet have you measured and mapped out this short life and its possibilities? Do you know, if you read this, that you cannot read that? That what you lose today, you cannot gain tomorrow? Will you go and gossip with your housemaid or your stable boy when you may talk with queens and kings? Or flatter yourself that it is with any worthy consciousness of your own claims to respect that you jostle with the hungry and common crowd for entree here and audience there, when all the while this eternal court is open to you, with its society wide as the world, multitudinous as its days, the chosen and the mighty of every place and time? Into that you may enter always. In that you may take fellowship and rank according to your wish. From that, once entered into it, you can never be outcast, but by your own fault. By your aristocracy of companionship there, your own inherent aristocracy will be assuredly tested, and the motives with which you strive to take high place in the society of the living, measured as to all the truth and sincerity that are in them by the place you desire to take in this company of the dead. The place you desire, and the place you fit yourself for, I must also say, because, observe, this court of the past differs from all living aristocracy in this: it is open to labor and to merit, but to nothing else. No wealth will bribe, no name overawe, no artifice deceive the guardian of those Elysian gates. In the deep sense, no vile or vulgar person ever enters there. At the portieres of that silent Faubourg Saint-Germain, there is but brief question. Do you deserve to enter? Pass. Do you ask to be the companion of nobles? Make yourself noble, and you shall be. Do you long for the conversation of the wise? Learn to understand it, and you shall hear it. But on other terms, no. If you will not rise to us, we cannot stoop to you. This then is what you have to do, and I admit that it is much. You must, in a word, love these people, if you are to be among them. No ambition is of any use. They scorn your ambition. You must love them. So I'll stop there, but that gives you a sense both of the sentences that Proust loved and imitated in his translations and learned from. Tadier, Proust's biographer, mentions that as one of the other great differences between Jean Santeuil and Remembrance of Things Past, that his work on Ruskin gave him the sentences that we know from Remembrance of Things Past.